two very real and important aspects. The first aspect deals with the State Land Regularization of Tenure Act, the amendments proposed, the state land, or what is now called the squatting regularization. Trinidad and Tobago will remember that the Prime Minister, in a public meeting on May 11th, I recall it is, announced to the population that all squatters would be regularized. We are advised that by May 14th, emergency meetings were held and that Cabinet had given an instruction that legislation be prepared. That legislation was to affect the law which deals with the regularization of squatters in a very simple way. On the one hand, to create areas called designated areas of squatting, identifying areas and labeling them as that within the meaning of the law, and secondly, something called a land settlement area. The bill was not withdrawn or lapsed by mistake. In fact, the government ought now to be aware, because sobriety has set in, that the bill could not pass. And it could not pass because there were inherent dangers in the bill. This amounts to an abuse of the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago, who were invited to rush to squat under the expectation that they would be regularized and that they would have not only a deed of comfort, but move on to a statutory lease, which is for 30 years, or a deed of lease, which is for a longer period. The bill, in fact, is unconstitutional. And it is unconstitutional because what the government did was to abridge and abuse the process by which land becomes designated land or land settlement land. And ladies and gentlemen, the law prescribes that in order for the schedule of the bill to be enlarged in the manner in which the Prime Minister suggests, she suggested that the 251 squatting sites which have existed in law since 1998, that those were to be increased to close to 800 sites. In doing that, she proposed to amend the law by simply including a new description of land. She did so on a simple majority basis, not inviting 3/5 of the Parliament to approve the law. What she did not factor is that you cannot simply amend the schedule by a simple majority without looking to the process of amending. The Prime Minister had the ability for the last 5 years to ask the Minister with responsibility for squatting supervision to bring an order to the Parliament, very simply, and for the Parliament to debate the inclusion of land. But what the Prime Minister has not told you is that the land must be approved by the Minister of Planning as a designated area. The law is very specific. Unless the Minister of Planning designates the new squatting land as being, after investigation, something which is approved by the Ministry of Planning, it cannot qualify to be included as squatting lands. And ladies and gentlemen, that has not been done. The designated areas have not received planning permission from the Minister of Planning, and they would include private lands and public lands. And so the Prime Minister perhaps has only now realized that that bill could not see the light of day. It is also important to note that the same thing applies when the Prime Minister sought to improve the area for land settlements. Land settlements areas are also areas from which you can get a deed of lease or you can get a statutory lease. What the Prime Minister has done is not to provide land for the landless. She has instead left the landless in limbo because they would never, under her arrangements, be allowed to get land. What they would get is only a certificate of comfort, which they cannot give to their families, which they cannot take to the bank, which they cannot use as security. And this amounts to a gross abuse of the most underprivileged people in Trinidad and Tobago, and no country should tolerate a government who is prepared to abuse the most humble citizens of the land in that way. Ladies and gentlemen, the second point that I propose to deal with very quickly in identifying how the Parliament has been abused, you are now aware that the government proposed an amendment to the insurance laws of Trinidad and Tobago. There was a 2013 insurance bill which went to a joint select committee and which I served on. That bill did excellent work, that committee did excellent work and consultation, and a new bill, a 2015 bill, was produced. We in the opposition literally pleaded with the Minister of Finance and the government to bring that new legislation in its final form, which none of us had seen, to the Joint Select Committee to allow for consultation. The government did not listen. They tabled a bill in the rush days of Parliament, and the opposition took the position that we would abstain on the bill because there was not adequate consultation and that there may be big loopholes and jeopardy in the legislation if the public consultation was not had. And that's what we did. Nonetheless, the government continued to push for that bill to pass. And ladies and gentlemen, last night in the Senate, I read out a letter coming from Lloyd's of London. It is dated the 3rd of June 2015. It was sent by email to the Honorable Larry Hawaii, the Minister of Finance and the Economy. And Lloyd's of London informed the Honorable Minister that Lloyd's had written last year alone close to $500 million of coverage in Trinidad and Tobago. And they specifically say in this letter, which I will pass to the media, they specifically say that it is important that Lloyd's be permitted to continue provision for specialist coverage. And they said that the accelerated progress of the current bill has impeded its ability to properly analyze and respond to its provisions. They go on to say that amendments to the legislation ought to be considered, and they say that it is important to recognize that insofar as there are excess of requirements in similar territories, that this bill would severely impact the appetite of underwriters at Lloyd's to underwrite risks in Trinidad and Tobago. Let me make this plain. One of the largest players in the international market, responsible as a reinsurer for underwriting major enterprises such as Petrotrin's business, such as major state assets, has written to the Minister of Finance and said, you have accelerated a bill. We have not had an opportunity to even consider it. $500 million of underwriting business, TT dollars, of underwriting business cannot look profitable for our underwriters, and that there may be a loss of appetite. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the very reason why a responsible opposition stands in the Parliament to defend the democracy of Trinidad and Tobago. Last night, the Minister of Finance said to the Senate that he had not received this email. I handed him a copy of the printout of the letter which I had received. I had not received an email myself. I had received a hard copy letter. I passed it to the Minister of Finance, and we have yet to hear what the government intends to do. This is why legislation cannot be rushed. This is why we stood to insist that the casino and gambling legislation go to a joint select committee, because on an analysis of the legislation, there was excessive criminalization which would allow for innocent infringement, so that casino workers themselves could find themselves facing $5 million fines and imprisonment in jail, even in circumstances where they were innocent of certain matters. That cannot be tolerated. And even though hard decisions have to be taken, an opposition, if it is being true to its oath, must insist upon proper process and defense of democracy. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.